Welcome to the podcast PUNKT.UA with Tinka
and Anna. This podcast is dedicated to Ukrainian studies.
We conduct interviews with scholars researching Ukraine.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA, the podcast of the UNDIPUS project,
which stands for Pluralizing Ukrainian Studies, Understanding the War in Ukraine. Welcome to the podcast PUNKT.UA. Today I'm very glad to introduce Dr. Oleksandr Zabirko. Hello, Oleksandr.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And our co-host Anya.
Hello.
May I introduce you shortly? You are an expert in Slavic literature and culture. You completed your PhD at the University of Münster in 2020, where you explored how Russian and Ukrainian contemporary literature shapes ideas of space and geopolitics. You worked as a researcher at the University of Bochum and Münster, and you hold degrees in languages, translation, and literature from Ukraine and Germany. Since 2020, you are working within the UNDIPUS project at the University of Regensburg. Would you like to add something about yourself or your academic way, which might be interesting?
Thank you for this introduction. I think it was quite comprehensive. I can perhaps add just a word about my Ukrainian background. I was born and raised in the Donbas, in the eastmost part of the country. And this might be relevant simply because this region is currently one of the main objects of my research. What I'm trying to say that there is also a personal connection.
How did you come to UNDIPUS project?
During my time in Münster, I and my colleague Alina Shempa, we formulated this very vague idea of comparing two industrial and mining regions of Eastern Europe. This is the Donbas and the Upper Silesia, and this is again has something to do with our background because Alina is from Upper Silesia and I'm from the Donbas. And of course, this biographical connection is usually not the best starting point for a serious academic inquiry. But from the very beginning, our intention was to go beyond mere nostalgia or simple affinity to our homelands, but rather to at least to try to model a conceptual framework for analyzing these territories in literature and in cinema. But of course, at that time, we were both fully absorbed with our PhD projects, and after that, as it always happens in academia, we took different paths and joined different institutions. So this idea remained like in archive or on the shelf. And when several years later, Roman Dubasevich from Greifswald approached me with this idea of applying for a network in Ukrainian studies, I thought immediately this might be the chance for this old idea to be reactivated. And this is how this project came to be into being, and this is how we both joined the UNDIPUS network.
You already mentioned you work together with Dr. Alina Shempa in Regensburg, and your project is called Poetics of Industrial Landscape, Donbas and Upper Silesia in Comparative Perspective. You already said this project examines how literature and film depict post-industrial living environments. It focuses on the impact of global and regional changes on old industrial regions. The study also explores the role of regional spaces, ecocritical perspectives, and the connection between borderlands and national centers. Could you describe your work a bit more in detail? For example, which texts or sources you use, which scientific approaches do you use?
Yes, we focus roughly on literature and film from the late 19th century up to the early 21st century, covering texts in Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, and German. So these are the main languages which are relevant to these two territories, to Upper Silesia and to the Donbas. Of course, our audience may have a look on the map and to find those territories, but saying in advance they are not neighboring regions. And in comparative studies, in borderland studies, there is quite frequent approaches to compare regions which are located, at least in some the neighborhood, right? And it's not the case with the Donbas and Upper Silesia, which makes the comparison a bit problematic, but I think at the same time a bit more interesting, because they do not share the same history, but they share several qualities or parameters which make them comparable. And our research, well, in terms of literature, in terms of material, our research spans a range of genres from early positivist text with clear social criticism about the life of miners with like naturalistic approach, to the socialist realism text of the Soviet time, like the Soviet mainstream industrial novels, to contemporary postmodernist literature. And again, in terms of genres, it may include poetry, prose, even popular songs from films, for example, especially in the Donbas context. The songs are quite relevant. The same is true for our analytical approach, which is, well, I would say intentionally diverse. It includes classical close reading of texts and elements of formal analysis alongside post-colonial or, as you said, ecocritical perspectives, to name just a few. So we consciously favor methodological plurality because it allows for a more detailed, more nuanced understanding of the region's literary and cinematographic representations. And again, in terms of sources, our research may include like both well-known canonical works as well as lesser-known or nearly forgotten authors, which are again worth rediscovering.
Can you give us some examples, for example, about the authors or the books, for example, you mentioned? For me, especially interesting the Ukrainian literature and poetics, because we already had the interview with Alina, who told us a bit about it.
Yeah, there are quite a few examples from German, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian perspectives. Speaking about Upper Silesia, we can mention German language novel by the writer named August Scholtes, the novel called Ostwind from the 1930s, which is quite an interesting adventure and picaresque novel from this minor region, Upper Silesia, which was very well received by the German audience at that time, but which was completely forgotten, or almost forgotten after the World War II, because of the lack of general interest in this regionalist Heimat literature, regionalist literature, and because of the loss of this territory for the West in Germany. But this text is something which is worth being rediscovered and reread. Well, maybe a bit paradoxical and a less obvious example from the Donbas is a well-known Russian classical writer Anton Chekhov, who is rarely associated with this region, but as a native of Taganrog on the Azov Sea, he considered this steppe region his homeland and provided quite a few texts about the first islands of industrializations there and about the social ruptures which came out with it and about the interethnic coexistence in this territory. Or from Ukrainian perspective, we can, of course, mention very prominent lyrical poet Volodymyr Sasura, who is, well, on the one hand associated with this region because he wrote a lot about it, but again, he is, as a part of a national canon, he is rarely analyzed, or his work is rarely analyzed from this deliberately regional perspective. So what would change in our attitude towards his poetic output if we consider him first and foremost the Donbas poet and not the Ukrainian poet at first glance? So these are just kind of few examples of like rediscovering, but there are of course a lot of unknown names from the Donbas. We can mention people who are writing in Greek language because we have Greek communities on the northern shore of the Azov Sea, who are writing in this very interesting Rumeyka language and the dialect of the Greek. These communities suffered a lot during Stalinist time, and in the recent years there was a tacit revival of a literary life there, which is again came to halt due to the occupation. There is literature in Yiddish, and then many, many other examples. So this is a very diverse and very flamboyant landscape.
These are fascinating examples. In general, literary and cinematographic representations are a special form of knowledge production. So what do these forms of representation of Donbas allow us to learn about the region itself, and what is left out? Perhaps some perspectives, themes, or voices are not included.
Well, first I would say literary texts do not simply reflect reality, even if they claim to do so. Rather, they construct particular narrative and particular reality according to aesthetic or ideological presuppositions. And this is especially evident with regard to the Donbas, which has been shaped by competing literary and, at lesser extent, cinematographic narratives over time. But there are, of course, certain dominant or stereotypical models which have emerged. So Soviet literature and cinema, for instance, largely adhered to the paradigm portraying Donbas as land of heroic coal miners. So the coal miner is, at least in Soviet literature, almost the sole inhabitant of this territory, which is, of course, a very reductionist view on this region. And this industrial mythology persisted even in post-Soviet representation of sideline themes such as ecological degradation of this territory, or interethnic relations and tensions, or the life expectancies of women, the role of the intellectuals. So this is all, which is, topics which can be found, of course, but they are not the dominant motives in literature and cinema. Yes, so part of our project is just the rediscovering and highlighting these silenced narratives.
There are many perspectives from which you can look at Donbas in Ukraine. So the industrial heart of the country, the main others, the source of all problems, etc. Many of them are marginalized and labeling the region and its inhabitants with negative connotation. These perspectives, to a certain extent, depend on the observer's perspective too. So who are the main authors? You already named some producing literature and cinematographic pieces about Donbas, but maybe some more from nowadays. And what relation do they have towards the region? What are the main narratives they produce? It would be interesting from the outside, from the inside, and so on.
There are very different people, of course, but generally we can say there are a lot of authors from the region who are writing about the region, but who are also successful on a larger national, even international scale. Probably with Serhiy Zhadan being the most prominent voice from the eastern part of the country, the most vocal representative of Ukrainian literature abroad. He wrote a lot about Donbas, very, very extensively, both lyrical text and in prose. There are authors which are a bit lesser known, but known nevertheless, like Lyuba Yakimchuk, another prominent lyrical poet from Lugansk region. She's been translated into various languages, English, French. Unfortunately, there's no German translation. This one is still yet to be done. But anyway, those people constructing an alternative view of the Donbas, alternative to the dominant Soviet paradigm I've been talking about. But they also challenge this very persistent and really entrenched narratives of the model of the two Ukraines, where the Donbas is considered, as you said, the main other of national, liberal, democratic, nationally conscious Ukraine. So Donbas is a contrast to that territory which is described as Russified, as proletarian, devastated, and generally the territory of decline, as a reservoir of the main other, or if for some people maybe the internal enemies of the state. And this is where the literature from this region really plays a crucial role in undermining these views. And this can occur on very different levels. There are writers who are overtly patriotic, and with their patriotism they want to contrast this image or destroy it. But there are, of course, much more sophisticated models of presenting Donbas or constructing maybe even the new myth of this region. And this is where literature and cinema play a very important role. However, we should also say that as the place of geopolitical tension, which is again a very euphemistic phrase for describing the war, but let's put it like this, there is place of contestation between Russian and Ukrainian views on the Donbas. And in the Russian literature, in the Russian war, nationalistic, pro-war, patriotic literature, Donbas again plays a crucial role as the avant-garde of the Russian world, of the Ruski Mir, as the bulwark against the hostile West, and as the place where Russian Federation returns to the global stage as a superpower and as an empire. And this text, like in the novels of texts of writers like Zakhar Prilepin, for example, or Alexander Prokhanov, many others, their narratives resonate with the historical image of this territory in the Russian literature of the late 19th and 20th century. We may come back to this very old but still vague idea of Novorossiya, the new Russia. This is how this territory, or part of this territory, was coined in the official parlance of the Russian Empire. And this is, well, if we translate this term, Novorossiya, it means new Russia, but it's also a clear statement of imperial ambition, because other empires created their new territories in the same way. We have New England, which is an eastern coast of the USA. We have Nueva España, which is Mexico today. And with this new Russian narrative, Russia reestablished or established itself as an empire. So it is in this eastern and southern steppe of today's Ukraine where Russia first articulated this ambition, and now it comes back to this territory, rediscovering these claims and reaffirming itself. So there is a constant tension between these two literatures, between these two competing views, and they are, of course, overshadowed by a very real military conflict there.
You mentioned an author who is like writing about Donbas, who is originally not maybe from the west of Ukraine, and
well, there are quite a few writers who went to this territory and became prominent. Well, we can mention, for example, the prominent Ukrainian dissident poet Vasyl Stus, who was born in central Ukraine in Vinnytsia region, but who went to Donbas in the early years with his family, and who's been working in Donetsk, and started his literary career there, who was very active in the magazine Socialistichny Donbas. And then he was arrested because of the was coined anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and he perished in the Gulag in 1985. Actually, already in the time of Perestroika, where the liberalization of political landscape was on the march, but not for everyone, not for people like Vasyl Stus, like Ukrainian poet from the Donbas. There are a few other examples, if you like people like Ivan Dzuba, for example, or Oleksandr Zabirko. These are very important representatives of Ukrainian dissident movement from the Donetsk region specifically. These people and they are work, their lives show that this story of a like Russified and totally denationalized territory is very reductionist.
What about cinema? Can you talk a bit about that? What role Donbas plays in Ukrainian cinema?
I think that there was a kind of parallelism between cinema and literature starting from the 1920s, and in the early years of the Soviet cinema, it was a very frequent case that literary works were put on the screen. But the cinematographic life of the Donbas starts not with that like fictional or like plain cinematograph, but with an avant-garde one. And here the crucial role is played by one of the film pioneers of the Soviet Union, David Kaufman, who is better known under his pseudonym Dziga Vertov. And in 1931, he produced the first, or one of the two first Soviet sound films, which was called Enthusiasm, the Donbas Symphony. So when the Soviet cinema audience first heard sound in the movies, these were the sounds of the Donbas, the sounds of industry. He was touring with this film across Europe, and he was lauded by instances like Charlie Chaplin, for example, a notorious opponent of sound movie until then, but he completely changed his mind after seeing this film. This film was, well, not prohibited by the Soviet censors, but put on the shelf because of its avant-garde aesthetics, because of the lack of the the role of the party was not on the main focus there, but rather the self-organizing masses of workers who adhere to the rhythm of the industry rather than to the decrees of like Communist Party from Moscow. And the later films from the 30s, they were trying to counterbalance these first steps made by Vertov, and we have films with very sentimental, lyrical narratives with a lot of songs, a lot of music, a lot of love, almost like melodramatic tales, which again was very popular probably until the early 60s. And this is how the image of this region was changed.
Anything happening in the contemporary Ukrainian cinema that represents Donbas?
Yes, of course, it plays, again, a crucial role. First of all, in the context of the war. There are war films which, well, naturally are settled there, but there are, of course, more sophisticated and complex cinematographic narratives which deal with, this genius loci of the Donbas. We can name, for example, their film Atlantis by Valentin Vasyanovich, an art house drama from 2019, which has again this war story at the background, but it's more about coming to terms with the lives on this devastated and ecologically ruined territory, finding its own place there, finding love and finding the reason to carry on. Very complex film, but the one which is worth looking at nevertheless.
You mentioned in the beginning that your project is looking at Donbas as one of the old industrial regions, so putting it in a kind of global context. If to look at the Donbas from the global perspective, we can indeed see it as an old industrial region, but not all industrial regions are in the state of perennial war, and also not all of them share this borderline position as Donbas does. How does the war and this position, special position of Donbas, geographical position or geopolitical position as an industrial region affects its self-image, and also how are these characteristics represented in the pieces you study?
Yeah, this is very good and very complex question, to be honest. Indeed, if we talk about comparing coal mining areas, everybody would name like 2-3 common features. And comparing the two regions we are interested in, like Upper Silesia and Donbas, there are couple more. For example, they are both, or used to be borderlands. At least Upper Silesia used to be a borderland between Polish and German cultural domains for quite a while. There are places of national tensions, which is, for example, not true for regions like the Ruhr area, which has never been a borderland, or English Midlands, where we don't have this. What also unites Upper Silesia and Donbas to some extent is the experience of planned economy. So this transition from early capitalist economy to planned economy and then back to capitalism, which is something we don't have on other territories. But again, you're quite right that the specificity of the Donbas and this borderland situation ended up with real war, not just hybrid wars. We had it between 2014 and 19, but a real full-scale war. And this shows us that unlike Upper Silesia, the Donbas became or remained trapped in the cycles of stagnation, exploitation, and conflict. But I don't have a kind of a solution or a positive ending to that story. But I think that precisely because of this specificity, it might be fruitful to look at the places like Upper Silesia and to see how this territory, how this region used to manage this similar problems in the past, although they are similar only to some extent. But this experience shows us that there is still post-apocalyptic future, which can, at least theoretically, become like period full of life and blossoming.
You already named some things the both regions have in common. Maybe you want to add something to this list. Maybe you can add something where they different, for example.
Speaking about these national dualities, for example, this dualism, German-Polish one in Upper Silesia or Russian-Ukrainian one in the Donbas, well, the commonality is that we have them, of course, but they produce quite different trajectories of interethnic relations. In Upper Silesia, we have a very strong regional identity with one's own distinct dialect, and currently for the regional community it's very important for this dialect to be recognized by Polish authorities. They have the other form of self-identification. They have the name for themselves, on Ślązakie, right? Something which we don't have in the Donbas, right? The people of the Donbas are people of the Donbas, right? They don't have like ethnonym. It used to be one in the 40s and 50s. This Donbasovцы in Russian was quite popular in literature, but then it disappeared. And in this recent famous or infamous statements by Putin, we have again this phrase like people of the Donbas should be protected. There is a genocide against whom? Against the people of the Donbas. Who are those people? There is no name for them. So this is something which differs. However, in the Donbas, we don't have this typical, or like maybe not typical, frequent case of national indifference as we have in many other regions of Eastern Europe, where people do not identify themselves in national terms, but we are just from here, like tutejszy, in the Belarusian case, in Lithuania, in Eastern Poland, in Ukrainian region of Polysia. We have it very frequently in the 19th century, but also late in the 20th one. In the Donbas, in all these censuses and polls, people are very clear about who they are and who the others are. And despite these overarching Soviet narratives of friendship and brotherly love, beyond it there is, of course, boundaries, tensions, maybe not clearly articulated, but even in literature we have this constant, at least on the level of subtext, the dualism and contestation of Ukrainian and Russian literatures, for example. This is again the scenario which differs from Upper Silesia. to a large extent. So the challenge for our project is just not to name or describe this phenomenon and say, well, we have in the 50s we have this, and in the 70s we have that, or in Upper Silesia we have this phenomenon, in Donbas another one, but to unite them within the framework of some conceptual model and to try to go beyond this mere description, to find some lines of representatives, self-representing these territories.
How does your personal origin from the Donbas influences your research? Do you think it has any impact?
I hope it doesn't, to be honest. I think it's very important for scholars to try to be neutral as much as it's possible. But of course, I cannot be entirely neutral and, for example, pretend I can seriously embrace this Russian geopolitical narrative of the Donbas. I can analyze it seriously, and I think it's worth analyzing, but I can't help being critical about it. So maybe there is kind of bias here. But I'm trying not to look a lot into my own story, the story of my family, and all those, anecdotes which we share, because in fact, and I think this is a very tragic situation, people from this region know not much about it. So they are really trapped within these stereotypes, within the fictional models. On the one hand, it shows us how important literature can be. Because if we have a region where there are constant conflicts and tensions and changes of political order, then the texts and films, they are like symbolic anchors where you reconstruct your reality and your view of the world. But on the other hand, as I said before, they do not represent reality as it was, but they construct its own image. And this is, I think, a big problem with regard to the Donbas. Another problem is, of course, there is a lot of very important literary cinematographic artifacts which are forgotten. So Dziga Verto, for example, is virtually unknown to the locals. He is known to people in the West. He is known to people in Kiev, for example. But if I ask my friends and relatives, well, have you heard about it? No idea who that was, why he was important. So, I try not to rely on my biographical background very much.
How is it in Upper Silesia? People there also reconstruct their identities through these narratives, or do you see there a difference?
I'm afraid I cannot provide an exhaustive answer to this question, because to do it, you need to make a sociological research. You need to ask them, right? So, but I think in Upper Silesia as well, films and texts are important. I cannot say to what extent they are important, but again, they fulfill this role of, well, to some extent, encyclopedias, to some extent of symbolical, points of reference for reconstruction or construction of one's own identity. But I'm not sure how I can describe the outreach of this text and films and how this reconstruction works. Probably this do not need to be a text for the mass audience. You always have agents who multiply these narratives or these messages. You have, museums, you have newspapers, journalists who may be attracted to some literal cinematographic representation. They multiply them and make them accessible to the larger regional, even national audience. Probably this is the way it works. But this is something which is beyond the scope of our research.
I have a last question. What do you mean by ecocritical thinking in relations to Donbas? What does it include? So how have environmental issues been addressed in the literary and cinematic depiction of Donbas?
Well, starting from the late 19th century, there is a constant tension between nature and industry in this region. These are two realms which are competing, which are overlaying each other, and which are symbolically charged in the literary text, first of all. And starting from that point, there are, of course, multiple directions which the authors may choose. They can celebrate the victory of industry over this realm of like wild nature, but they can also romanticize nature and its destruction as the destruction of the normal realm for people to live, right? There are very, very different models of accessing it, but what we do not have until, probably late Soviet time is the ecocritical perspective per se, where the destruction of nature is criticized not only like symbolically, there's something beautiful is destroyed, but also from the point of view of pragmatic attitudes. So what problems arise for communities? For example, the shortage of water is a constant problem in the Donbas, or the air pollution. This comes much later. And this is again typical for this coal mining area. So we can think about rural area where this smokes which unites the towns was a symbol of local pride. And when the smokes disappear, there's a feeling of loss, although the air is getting better actually. But on the symbolical level, this is of course the loss. Speaking about that, of course, we should mention that Donbas, particularly the city of Mariupol, was the site of the major ecological protests in Ukraine in early 2000s. This is something which not necessarily has to do with literature or cinema, but this shows that for the local communities, this ecocritical perspective was becoming even more present and important. Or coming back to the film, which I already mentioned, Atlantis by Vasyanovich, there we have the story about the polluted zone where there's no water and people have to leave this territory, albeit we do not know whether this destruction comes as a result of war or as a result of this extractivist economy, which was dominant there for almost 100 years. But again, in Ukrainian cinema and literature, these topics are becoming more and more prominent. We have here some interesting dialogue between text about Donbas and the text about Chernobyl, another polluted zone which is very prominent in Ukraine. They used, probably we can say there was a potential in it, but now I think it is impossible to talk about ecology only speaking about the territory where the war is going on, which is a site of an occupation. But let's hope that in the future these topics will arise once again.
Thank you for being with us. It was our great pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Oleksandr. And thank you, Anya, for preparing and co-hosting this interview podcast today. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
This was the podcast PUNKT.UA,
which is part of the UNDIPUS project at the University of Greifswald,
supported by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research.
Join us on the PUNKT.UA podcast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.